The ghost of cordite stung my nostrils, a sharp, chemical tang that clung to the damp sea air long after the torpedo boats had ceased their barking. It was a warning shot, they'd said. A reminder of where true authority lay. But as I stood on the foredeck of the SMS Friedrich der Grosse, my hands raw from the capstan, all I could feel was the tremor of fury that ran through the deck plates, a vibration that had nothing to do with the engines coming to life. Anchors were being weighed. On our ship, on the Ostfriesland, on the Nassau, all down the line of grey steel leviathans that choked the Wilhelmshaven roadstead. The rattling of the massive chains was a deathly sound, the final protest of a fleet being dragged from its grave.
Hello, I'm Truly. If this is your first time or you're a frequent listener on my channel, welcome. If you haven't done it already, do not forget to like, subscribe, and click the notify button to listen to more stories in the future. Thank you.
2 years. 2 years, we had rusted here, prisoners of peace in a time of war. We'd watched the U-boat crew swagger through the port towns, flush with prize money and tales of adventure, while we, the pride of the high seas fleet, scrubbed decks and starved on turnip water that masqueraded as soup. The Battle of Jutland, our glorious Skagerrakschlacht, was a faded photograph in our minds. A day of fire and thunder that had earned us this, a slow, agonizing rot. Morale was a currency we had spent long ago. They actually did it, Karl. A voice rasped beside me. It was Klaus, his face gaunt, his eyes burning with a feverish light that scared me more than any British shell ever had. The bastards on the torpedo boats fired on their own brothers. They fired over their bows, Klaus. A warning, I corrected, though the words tasted like ash in my mouth. My knuckles were white where I gripped the railing. Across the slate-grey water, I could see the silhouettes of SMS Helgoland and Thuringen. They were moving now, their mutiny apparently crushed, or at least, paused. A warning today, a killing shot tomorrow, he spat. For what? One last death ride? A final, glorious sacrifice for the Kaiser and his cronies while they sip champagne in Berlin? They can have it. I won't give them my bones to pave a path to Valhalla. He was right, of course. We all knew it. The rumor had slithered through the mess decks and engine rooms like a poisonous serpent. A final, desperate lunge at the English coast, a suicide run to salvage the honor of the Navy. Our honor. As if honor could fill a starving belly or put a stop to the endless, pointless war. The order had been disobeyed. On Thuringen and Helgoland, men had extinguished the boiler fires, dropped tools, and refused to weigh anchor. A simple, defiant, no. It was the bravest thing I'd seen since Jutland, and now, under the threat of being shelled by our own escort craft, that bravery had buckled. The Friedrich der Grosse, as flagship, was a tinderbox. The officers walked the decks in pairs, their hands never far from their sidearms. They barked orders with a forced, brittle confidence that fooled no one. We obeyed. We turned the wheels, worked the capstans, and reported for our watches. But our movements were mechanical, sullen. The soul had gone out of us. We were a crew of ghosts, haunting our own ship. As the Wilhelmshaven lighthouse receded into the morning mist, a grim silence settled over the fleet. There was no singing, no boisterous chatter, just the rhythmic thrum of the turbines and the hiss of the sea parting before our bow. We were heading out into the cold, unforgiving North Sea that had already claimed so many. For hours, we steamed in formation, a magnificent parade of obsolescence. I was assigned to a damage control party, and we spent the afternoon in drills that felt more like a macabre dance than a practical exercise. Our leader was Lieutenant Vogel, a young officer barely out of his teens, with a face as smooth as a girl's and an arrogance that could curdle milk. Faster, he snapped, as we struggled to haul a heavy collision mat across the deck. The Royal Navy will not wait for you to catch your breath. Do you want to die because of a lazy comrade? An older sailor, Gunther, a man who'd served since before I was born, stumbled, his worn boots slipping on a patch of moisture. He went down hard, the wind knocked out of him. Vogel was on him, in an instant. On your feet, old man. This is a warship, not a retirement home. Something snapped. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a shout. It was the collective, sudden stillness of a dozen men. Tools were lowered. The hauling stopped. Every eye was on Vogel, and the look in them was murderous. Klaus took a half-step forward, his hands clenched into fists. I felt a cold dread wash over me. This was it. The spark. Vogel's face paled. He had felt the shift, the sudden withdrawal of obedience. His authority, which 36 hours ago was absolute, was now a thin sheet of ice over a raging torrent. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked from Klaus's simmering rage to Gunther, still struggling for air, and then to the rest of our dead-eyed expressions. He took a step back. As you were, he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Take a 5-minute break. He turned and walked away, his back ramrod straight, but I knew he was fleeing. Klaus helped Gunther to his feet. Are you all right, old-timer? Gunther coughed, his face ashen. He's just a boy playing soldier. But a boy like that can get us all killed. He looked out at the endless grey sea. They're taking us to die, aren't they, Karl? I couldn't answer, I just nodded. The mood soured further. Word of Vogel. As humiliation spread, small acts of defiance began to ripple through the ship. A vital wrench for a steam valve went missing. A stoker reported a boiler losing pressure, forcing a reduction in speed. The reports were delivered with blank-faced innocence, impossible to challenge without admitting you'd lost control of your men. The officers knew. We knew they knew. It was a silent war, fought not with guns, but with negligence and insubordination. By evening, we anchored in the Schillig roadstead, a final staging point before the push into the channel. The order came down, prepare for battle. Full steam on all boilers by 0600. This was the final command. The point of no return. I found Klaus in the cavernous torpedo room, his silhouette stark against the faint glow of a battle lantern. He was speaking in low, urgent tones to a group of men from the engine rooms and gun crews. They can't sail without us, he was saying. They can't fire the guns, they can't stoke the boilers, they can't patch the holes, the ship is ours, we are the fleet. He saw me and beckoned me over. Karl, it's time. No more warnings, no more quiet disobedience. Tonight, we douse the fires, we disable the gun elevators, we make it impossible for them to sail, not just us. The message is being passed to the Ostfriesland, to the Nassau. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't refusing to weigh anchor. This was sabotage. This was high treason. Men were shot for less. But what was the alternative? Sailing into the muzzles of the British Grand Fleet for the sake of an officer's honor? Dying for a cause that was already dead and buried? I looked at the faces around me. They weren't wild-eyed revolutionaries. They were tired, hungry men who wanted to live. They were fathers, sons, and husbands who had been pushed too far. I thought of Lieutenant Vogel and his contempt. I thought of Gunther, gasping on the deck. I thought of the thin, watery soup and the 2 years of gnawing emptiness. What do you need me to do? I asked, my voice hoarse. A grim smile touched Klaus' lips. Welcome to the revolution, comrade. My task was simple, yet profound. I was part of the watch near the forward ammunition hoists. With 2 others, our job was to ensure a mechanical failure, a jammed gear, a severed cable, something that would take hours to fix, if it could be fixed at all. In the dead of night, under the pretense of a routine inspection, we descended into the guts of the ship. The air was thick with the smell of grease and cold steel. The silence was immense, broken only by the ship's groaning and the distant thrum of the auxiliary generators. Using a heavy wrench, a man named Friedrich, a quiet mechanic I barely knew, worked with practiced ease on a critical gear assembly. With a sickening crack, a primary cog shattered. The hoist was dead. We worked our way back to the mess deck. The ship was eerily quiet. Too quiet. On the main deck, there was no activity. The boilers were cold. The usual pre-battle preparations were non-existent. Dawn broke on October 31st, not with the roar of a fleet preparing for war, but with a profound, defiant silence. The order for full steam had been ignored. On the Friedrich de Gross, the Thüringen, the Helgoland, the Ostfriesland, all across the fleet, the sailors had taken control. Red flags, the symbol of socialist revolt, were rumored to be flying from the masts of other ships. The officers were trapped on their bridges, issuing orders into a void. They were captains of dead ships. By midday, the final, unbelievable order was relayed. The operation was cancelled. The fleet was to return to port. We had won. As the Friedrich de Grosse sluggishly turned, pointing her bow back towards Wilhelmshaven, I stood at the railing, watching the other steel giants follow suit. There were no cheers, no triumphant shouts, just a dazed, anxious quiet. We had stared into the abyss and forced it to blink, but in doing so, we had broken something far greater than a naval operation. We were sailors who had defied our captains, soldiers who had laid down our arms. Looking at the grim faces of my comrades, I realized the truth. We hadn't just refused an order, we had sunk an empire, and none of us knew what would surface in its place. The cold, damp air of Wilhelmshaven had a taste to it. A metallic tang of rust and coal smoke mixed with the brine of the North Sea. For 2 years it had been the taste of our idleness, our shame. We were sailors of the high seas fleet, the pride of the Kaiser, and we were rotting in port. I am Karl, a simple seaman, and my world was the steel deck of the dreadnought Friedrich de Gross. My hands, meant for loading breeches and tying knots at sea, had grown soft with the endless, mind-numbing routine of holystoning decks that were already clean and polishing brass that gleamed with pathetic brilliance. The Battle of Jutland was a story the old hands told, a fading epic of fire and thunder on the waves. Men like Gunther, with his face a roadmap of sea-weathered wrinkles and his hands gnawed like old rope, had been there. He'd seen the British Grand Fleet up close, felt the ship shudder as our guns spoke. Now, he mostly just smoked his pipe and stared at the grey water, the fire in his eyes long banked. They leave the real fighting to the U-boats, my friend Klaus would grumble, his voice a low curse, as we ladled thin turnip soup into our bowls. It was always turnips. They're the heroes now, sinking merchants. And what are we? A fleet in being, a threat on a map, a bluff. He wasn't wrong. The inaction gnawed at use worse than the hunger. It created a vacuum, and into that vacuum crept resentment, bitterness, and whispers of change. Then came the order. A final glorious sortie into the Channel. A death ride. We were to be a sacrifice to wring some last-ditch concession at the negotiating table. But we were done being sacrificed. The crews of the Helgoland and Thuringen refused first. They doused the boilers. The silence from their smokestacks was a shout of defiance that echoed through the fleet. The response was swift. Sleek torpedo boats, our own little brothers in the Navy, trained their deck guns and torpedo tubes on the battleships. The message was clear. Obey or be sunk in the harbor. The Mutiny, for a moment, fizzled out under that threat. Reluctantly, anchors were weighed. A strange sense of purpose filled us as we steamed into the open sea. The ship came alive, the deck vibrating with the power of the engines, the salt spray a clean baptism on our faces. For a few hours, we were sailors again. Vice Admiral Kraft, a man we had only ever seen as a remote figure in immaculate white, put us through our paces. The entire squadron executed a complex battle maneuver, a Gefechtskirtwendung that had us turning in perfect, synchronized harmony. Look at that, I murmured to Klaus. A flicker of the old pride stirring in my chest as the massive ships wheeled like a flock of iron birds. We can still do it. Klaus spat over the rail. A pretty dance for the Admiral. It proves nothing, Carl. Except that a whipdog will still do tricks for its master. His words soured the moment. He was right. Admiral Kraft saw the flawless execution not as a sign of our skill, but as a sign of our submission. He believed he had broken our will. And so, when we dropped anchor in Kiel, he moved to cut the head off the snake. The word spread like a fever. 47 men from the Markgraf, men deemed the ringleaders of the Wilhelmshaven unrest, had been arrested. They weren't just confined to the brig. They were taken ashore, marched under guard to the grim walls of Fort Herworth. They were political prisoners. A silence fell over the Friedrich der Grosse. It was a heavy, loaded silence, far more menacing than the shouting in Wilhelmshaven. We had followed orders. We had performed his little sea dance flawlessly. And this was our reward. Betrayal. Gunther tapped out his pipe against the capstan, his expression grim. The fool, he rasped, his voice low and gravelly. He thinks he's a surgeon, cutting out a tumor. But he's just spilled poison into the bloodstream. The next morning, the ship's telegraph jangled with the order. Weigh anchor. Prepare to depart. No N moved. The stokers in the ship's belly let the boiler pressure fall. The men on the forecastle stood with their arms crossed, staring at the anchor chain as if it were a venomous snake. That's when Lieutenant Vogel appeared on deck. Vogel was a young, sharp-faced man with eyes that never seemed to blink and a sneer permanently etched onto his thin lips. He thrived on humiliating us, finding fault in a perfectly tied knot, a speck of dust on a boot. He was the embodiment of the officer class that ate meat while we had watery turnips, that slept in warm bunks while we shivered in damp hammocks. You heard the order, you filthy swine, he shrieked, his voice cracking with fury. He strode up to a young sailor, barely 17, and jabbed a finger into his chest. Are you deaf? Or just stupid? Weigh the damn anchor. The boy flinched but held his ground, his knuckles white. The rest of us watched, a silent, unmoving wall of blue uniforms. The air was thick with a tension you could cut with a bayonet. I asked you a question, sailor. Vogel screamed, his face turning a blotchy red. Something inside me snapped. The hunger, the boredom, the betrayal, it all coalesced into a single point of cold, hard clarity. I took a step forward. He's not deaf, Herr Lieutenant, I said. My voice was steady, shockingly so. And he's not stupid. Vogel's head whipped around, his eyes locking onto me. And who is this? Seaman Karl, the sea lawyer. Have you something to say? Yes, Herr Lieutenant. I stood straighter, feeling Klaus and Gunther move closer behind me, a silent show of support. We're not leaving. Not while our comrades are locked in that fort. We're not abandoning them. Your comrades are mutineers. Traitors. They're sailors. Just like us. Gunther's deep voice boomed from my shoulder. He took a slow step forward, and even Vogel seemed to shrink a little under the weight of his age and presence. They stood up for all of us. You lock them up, you lock us all up. We go nowhere. Vogel's hand drifted towards the pistol on his belt. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. 100 men on deck held their breath. Would he draw it? Would he shoot one of us? He looked from my face to Gunther's, then at the sea of hard, unyielding eyes around him. He saw he was alone, a captain on an island of his own making. With a choked sound of disgust, he spun on his heel and stormed back towards the superstructure. The victory was hollow. We had won the deck. But what now? The admirals would simply starve us out or send the Marines. We were trapped on our own ships. That evening, a small group of us gathered in the dim light of a service corridor, hidden from the eyes of the remaining officers. Gunther, Klaus, myself, and a few others from the engine room. They won't listen to us, Klaus said, pacing the narrow space. Why would they? We're just sailors. That's right, Gunther said, his calm voice cutting through the anxiety. He pointed a thick finger towards the twinkling lights of Kiel on the shore. We are sailors. They are civilians. We have the guns, but they have the numbers. They're hungry too. They're tired of the war too. Their sons and husbands are dying in the trenches for nothing, just like we were supposed to die in the Channel. A new idea, radical and dangerous, began to form in the cramped corridor. Our protest was no longer just a naval affair. What are you saying, Gunther? I asked, my heart beginning to pound with a different kind of rhythm, not fear, but a wild, terrifying hope. I'm saying our fight isn't with Vogel or Kraft anymore, he said, his eyes meeting each of ours in turn. It's bigger. The officers think this is a shipboard problem. We have to make it a citywide problem. We need to talk to them. The dock workers, the shipyard unions, the social democrats. It was treason, plain and simple. But the word had lost its sting. What was loyalty to a regime that demanded your life for its own pride, and then tossed your brothers in a dungeon? 2 hours later, Klaus and I, dressed in scavenged civilian clothes that smelled of mothballs, slipped over the side of the Friedrich de Gross, and into a small boat rowed by a sympathetic stoker. As we pulled for the dark shore of Kiel, I looked back at the silent, hulking silhouettes of the high seas. Fleet. They were giants, bristling with guns, symbols of imperial power. But they were our prisons no longer. They were our fortresses, and we were rowing ashore not as fugitives but as emissaries. We were going to ask the people of Germany to join our mutiny. We were going to set the fire. The crack of the rifles echoed for a moment, then was swallowed by a sound the German Empire had not heard in a generation, the roar of genuine, bottomless fury. The volley from Steinhauser's platoon was meant to be a final, terrifying punctuation mark, a full stop to the insubordination. Instead, it was the first word of a new and terrible chapter. The crowd did not scatter and flee. They recoiled, a human wave pulling back from a toxic shore, dragging their dead and wounded with them. But the shock, the searing grief, did not curdle into fear. It hardened instantly into resolve. The sailors in the prison were no longer just comrades to be freed. They were the first prisoners of a war that had just been declared on them. The 7 dead were no longer just protesters. They were the first martyrs. Through the night, the news of the Kiel bloodbath spread not like a rumor but like a firestorm. It traveled on the lips of frantic workers, carried by sympathetic railwaymen, and tapped out by telegraph operators who deliberately ignored official orders to censor the lines. The story was simple, brutal, and galvanizing. The Kaiser's officers were gunning down hungry, unarmed Germans in the streets for demanding peace and justice. By the morning of November 4th, the situation had transformed. The protest of several thousand had swelled to a mass of over 40,000. And crucially, they were no longer alone. Delegations of soldiers from the city barracks, having spent a night debating their loyalties, marched out to join them. They did not come to disperse the crowd, but to become part of it. They handed over rifles, shared ammunition, and pinned red scraps of cloth to their grey uniforms. The line between soldier and civilian, between the state and the people, had dissolved. Faced with an entire city in open, armed revolt, the authorities collapsed. The remaining loyal troops were hopelessly outnumbered, and more importantly, their will was broken. By midday, the revolutionaries controlled Kiel. Their first act was to storm the prison, not as a mob, but as an organized force. The gates were smashed open, and the mutinous sailors were carried out on the shoulders of the crowd, bewildered and then ecstatic, emerging from their cells to find the world irrevocably changed. But the spirit of Kiel could not be contained within the city limits. It traveled with the speed of a modern army, carried by train and telegram to every major port and industrial center in the nation. In Hamburg, Bremen, and Wilhelmshaven, Sailors and workers formed their own revolutionary councils. In Munich, a socialist journalist named Kurt Eisner began to rally the Bavarian masses. In Berlin, the government of Prince Max of Baden watched in horror as the foundations of the Reich crumbled, not from external pressure from the Allies, but from a catastrophic internal collapse. The blood spilled on the cobblestones of Kiel was not a stain to be washed away, but a seed from which a new, uncertain and tumultuous Germany would grow. The Kaiser's time was running out. The rust was a living thing. It crept over the grey steel of the SMS Friedrich de Gross, like a disease, flaking under our fingernails as we scraped and painted, an endless, meaningless ritual. For 2 years, since the fires of Jutland had cooled, this had been our war. War. Against corrosion and boredom, fought with chipped scrapers and watery paint in the stagnant air of Wilhelmshaven harbor. More spirit, Karl. Klaus grunted beside me, his knuckles white, as he scrubbed at a stubborn patch. Pretend it's a British cruiser's hull. I snorted, the sound echoing flatly against the bulkhead. If it were a cruiser, we'd be loading shells, not fighting filth. At least the U-boat crews are still in the fight. The words hung between us, the familiar ghost of our resentment. They were the wolves of the sea, the hunters. We were the caged lions, once the pride of the Kaiserliche Marine, now left to rot in our own magnificent, immobile zoo. Gunther, his face a leathery map of sea miles, and his back permanently stooped from a lifetime of service, paused in his work. He spat a stream of tobacco juice over the rail. A fight is a fight, boys. Don't be so eager to find one. I saw enough at Jutland to last me. But this, he kicked a loose rivet with the toe of his boot. This is a slow death. An insult. As if summoned by the word, Lieutenant Vogel appeared on the deck above, his white uniform impossibly pristine, his face pinched with disdain. He was a boy playing at being an officer, his authority derived solely from his commission, not an ounce of it earned. His eyes, cold and blue as the North Sea in winter, scanned our work. They landed on Klaus. Sailor. Vogel's voice was a whip crack. Is that the best you can do? My grandmother could scrub with more vigor, and she's been dead for 10 years. Klaus stiffened, his face flushing crimson. Sir, You will address me as Herr Lieutenant, Vogel snapped, descending the ladder with a fluid arrogance. He ran a gloved finger over the spot Klaus had just cleaned, then held it up, showing a faint smear of grime. Pathetic. You eat the Kaiser's rations, you wear his uniform, and you can't even perform the simplest of duties. Another hour of this for you after the evening meal. Perhaps hard work will sweat the incompetence out of you. Klaus's jaw worked, but he said nothing. Gunther and I just kept our heads down, the familiar burn of humiliation settling in our guts. It was worse than the thin turnip soup, worse than the endless inactivity. It was the daily reminder that we were not men, but tools, and rusty ones at that. That evening, the rumors started. A whisper in the mess hall, a furtive conversation in the hammocks. The fleet was to sail, not for drills, but for a final, glorious battle. A death ride into the English Channel to break the blockade or die trying. It was an order born of desperation from an admiralty that had forgotten we were men of flesh and blood, not pawns to be sacrificed in a final futile gesture. The next morning, the order came, weigh anchor. But something was different. A silence fell over the Friedrich der Grosse. Then, from across the water, we heard it, a roar of defiance from the crews of the Helgoland and the Thuringen. They refused. The sound was electric, a current that shot through every man on our deck. We looked at each other, a wild hope dawning in our eyes. The hope was short-lived. Torpedo boats, loyal to the officers, swarmed the mutinous battleships like angry hornets. The threat of their tin fish was enough. The mutiny was quelled, for now. Under the menacing gaze of the torpedo boats, anchors were weighed across the fleet. We sailed, not to the Channel, but to the roadstead off Kiel. There, Vice Admiral Kraft, in a display of what he believed was restored dominance, had us perform a series of complex maneuvers. The great dreadnoughts moved as one, a flawless, mechanical ballet. Kraft soll obedience. We felt only the bitter taste of coercion. He thought he had broken us. To prove it, he made his gravest mistake. He ordered the arrest of 47 sailors from the Markgraf, men he deemed the ringleaders. They were shackled and taken ashore to the military prison at Fort Herworth. The news spread through the fleet like wildfire. It wasn't about a suicide mission anymore. It was about our brothers, locked away for daring to have a will of their own. The wound Kraft had tried to cauterize was ripped wide open, and now it was festering. They've made martyrs of them, Gunther said that night, his voice a low growl. Fools. Arrogant fools. The next order to weigh anchor, to leave Kiel, was met with a unified, silent refusal. Every ship, Every crew. An entire fleet lay paralyzed, held fast by the iron will of its sailors. Our demands were simple: release our comrades. The Admiralty ignored us. So we turned to the city. Klaus, ever the firebrand, was among the first to volunteer for the shore party. I went with him, and Gunther, surprisingly, joined us. Been a sailor for 40 years, he muttered, buttoning his pea coat. Never seen the like. I aim to see how it ends. We found a city ready to boil over. The workers in the shipyards, the union men, they'd suffered the same hunger, the same hardships. Our cause became their cause. By the afternoon, we were no longer a delegation of sailors. We were a mob. Thousands of us sailors in our dark blue uniforms, workers in their grease-stained overalls, a great, surging river of humanity flowing through the streets of Kiel, our destination the prison. The air crackled with a dangerous energy. Shouts of Freiheit, freedom, and Lass sie frei, set them free, echoed off the stone buildings. We were an army, 40,000 strong, armed with righteous fury and a scattering of pilfered sidearms. We reached the prison square. Blocking our path was a thin line of soldiers, their bayonets fixed, their faces pale and young. At their head stood a Lieutenant Steinhauser, a man cast from the same mold as Vogel. He held a saber, its polished steel catching the grey afternoon light. "Disperse at once," he commanded, his voice tight with either fear or fury. "This is an illegal assembly. Disperse, or we will open fire." The crowd surged, pressing us forward. A rock flew from somewhere behind me, clattering uselessly against the prison wall. The pressure was immense, a physical force pushing us toward the bayonets. I lost sight of Klaus, but felt Gunther's solid presence beside me. "Hold, Karl," he breathed. "Don't let them break you." Steinhauser raised his saber. "Last warning." A great, unified neen roared back from 1,000 throats. The saber fell. The world exploded in a crackle of rifle fire. The sound was deafening, a sharp, tearing volley that ripped through the roar of the crowd. Men in front of me crumpled. A worker, not 5 feet away, spun around with a look of stunned surprise, a dark flower blooming on his chest, and fell. Screams replaced the shouts of defiance. The front of the crowd recoiled, a human wave breaking and churning in panic and agony. For a heartbeat, there was only chaos. Then, something else took over. The fear curdled into rage. From within our ranks came the pop, pop, pop of pistols. A sailor near me, his face a mask of fury, dropped to one knee, took careful aim with a Mauser C-96, and fired. I saw one of the soldiers stagger back, clutching his shoulder. The soldiers, boys themselves, wavered. Their volley had not broken us, it had enraged us. They had fired on unarmed Germans. The line broke. They fell back, dragging their wounded, Steinhauser among them, his uniform stained with his own blood. The retreat was a signal. The mob, now a revolutionary force, surged forward. The prison gates stood no chance. They were splintered by hammers and sheer human force. I was swept along with the tide, my feet barely touching the ground. We poured into the courtyard, a vengeful flood. The 47 prisoners were freed, carried out on the shoulders of sailors and workers, their faces a mixture of disbelief and fierce joy. I found Klaus near the broken gate, his face pale but his eyes burning. He had a bloody tear in his sleeve from a ricochet. "Did you see it, Karl?" he yelled over the din. "They fired on us, on their own people." Gunther appeared, his expression grim. He was helping a wounded dock worker, his own bandana tied around the man's arm. He looked from us to the cheering crowd, then to the city beyond. "This isn't about the 47 men anymore," he said, his voice heavy with finality. "It's not about the fleet. They spilled German blood to protect a prison wall. Everything has changed now." He was right. When we returned to the Friedrich de Gross, the officers were ghosts on their own ship. We were in command. The spirit of Kiel spread like a contagion of liberty. Wilhelmshaven erupted. Our 14 points, demanding everything from the abolition of the salute to better rations, were drafted not as a request, but as an ultimatum. Within days, the news was staggering. Munich had risen. King Ludwig of Bavaria had fled. The revolution, born in our squalid harbor, and baptized in the blood on Kiel's cobblestones, was consuming the German Empire. I stood on the deck, looking not at the rust but at the shore. I was no longer just a sailor waiting to die of boredom. I was something new, something I didn't have a name for yet. We had refused to sail on a death ride for the Kaiser, only to find ourselves steering the entire nation into an unknown, tempestuous sea. The fight we had yearned for had finally found us, not on the waves of the North Sea, but in the streets of our own country.